Welcome, everyone. It's good to see you all. Thanks for coming today. I want to talk today about creativity and making the practice your own. And those of you who've heard me speak before um, may have heard me talk about creativity and practice and how important it is. And one of my kind of obsessions in practice actually is how to make it work better for more people. And we have a group here of seasoned practitioners, which is lovely. You've all got some experience, even if you're moderately new, you're a ways into it. Uh, and some people with years and years of experience. So the thing that I think, I wonder about a lot is why do some people seem to completely transform their lives through this practice and other people, everybody benefits from it, of course. Everybody gets calmer, clearer, less reactive, or at least we should talk if that's not happening for you, because that's kind of basic stuff that happens from a meditation practice. But there's a lot more that's possible, and that complete transformation of one's life. And I know it personally because in my 20s and 30s, and actually in childhood and adolescence, and into my 20s, I was very timid and withdrawn and basically frightened, and had a lot of problems with anxiety. And I got over that largely through practice. But nonetheless, into my 30s, I was still struggling with depression. And at this point, I haven't had a problem with either one for decades. And my timidity dropped off to the point where I discovered to my amazement that I'm actually an extrovert. And I had thought I was an introvert and was shy and all these things. But that was just a system of thoughts that came out of fear. I was in a foster home for 2 years in childhood, as probably many of you have heard me say that. And I actually experienced abuse in that foster home. So that left me quite a timid kid and into young adulthood. But because I was suffering so much in so many ways, it really drove me into practice. And because I started practicing on my own, just kind of experimenting with practice in my 20s, really, I didn't go into formal practice till I was 30. And that was because I got myself into deep waters with depression and I knew I needed help. So that's when I sought a teacher. But nonetheless, I've been practicing on my own and making discoveries enough that it never occurred to me to only listen to what my teachers said. I'd always heard about Zen, that of course you take the guidance of your teachers, but the primary thing is to investigate your own mind and heart and look into yourself and discover what's there. It's a process of exploration and even adventure. So, by the way, I encourage you to all listen to talks in general with the mind of Zazen. And although I do like to make some eye contact, if everybody's sitting there with their eyes half lidded and looking at the floor, it gets a little weird because you don't know what connection you're making with people. But you can do that some, and then maybe glance up from time to time. But basically, I've had some important experiences in having a teacher say something when I was holding that mind of Zazen during a talk, and something just clicked for me in a way I don't think it would have clicked if I wasn't holding that mind. So I know it's a bit of a practice in itself to try and listen from that state of immersion in the practice, but and also, of course, to to do some reaction and, make some eye contact. But that's what I encourage as best you can. So I just want to use a few examples of creativity and practice and how I engaged that and how I'm encouraging you all to engage it. The first thing is that, and many of you have heard me mention this before, is that it's necessary to contemplate the teachings. I think everybody knows they have to sit. That's the basis of the practice, right? And they have to, one way or another, hear or read or receive the Dharma. But I think many of us don't take the initiative to then investigate it for ourselves and ponder it and think about it. When we're not sitting, when we're in our daily lives, when we're in a quiet moment, we can turn over what we've heard about the teachings and weigh it against our lives and ask ourselves, well, what does this mean? One of my main topics I go back to again and again, and you'll hear me talk about it a lot, is this whole Buddhist Buddhist view of the self, or which the Buddha calls non-self, which is quite radical. And we should be asking ourselves, what could he possibly mean by that? I mean, it doesn't mean I'm not here. I'm obviously here. You all are about 1,000 miles away in the Toledo Sangha from where I am. And although time and distance are more malleable than we think, nonetheless, I can't possibly be exactly you, and you all can't possibly be exactly me. We're obviously individuals. But what is the Buddha talking about when he says there's no such thing as a separate self? This is something we should consider and wonder about. Really wondering about it is what I'm talking about. A few examples from my own practice. We'll have a chance to discuss this somewhat too. I noticed one of the first times I tried to meditate is I remember I must have been 20 or 21 years old, and I was in Santa Barbara. I was going to University of California, Santa Barbara. And I remember sitting on the cliff top and trying meditation. And I noticed this thing, which was at the end of the exhale, there's just a moment there when the exhale finishes and the inhale is about to begin. For some people, it's just an instant or a moment, or with me, it varies. Sometimes it is an instant or a moment. Sometimes there's a little pause there. But that pause has this particular quality of stillness. And I noticed that somehow, and I just started working with it. And I thought, what's that feeling? It's kind of a feeling of almost being drawn in. And that must be the destination or where we're going in meditation. That must be, that must be an open door somehow. I somehow intuitively knew that. And I have since found out that this is a known thing. And in fact, there's Tibetan practices that use that extensively and try and prolong the pause. But I didn't find out about that till more than a decade later. And of course, if we're investigating our practice, we're going to make discoveries. And the discoveries are likely to have been made by other people as well over the 2,500 or so years these practices. Actually, they've existed that long in Buddhism, and they predate Buddhism, so thousands of years. So other people probably noticed this too, but I didn't realize it at the time. But nonetheless, finding it for myself had weight. It had a weight that was probably more significant because I found it myself. And many things, when we start investigating the mind, are like that. A spark will go off because we've discovered something through our creative engagement. But in fact, let's take a moment now and just look and see if that isn't so. If it's not so, that We kind of ride the length of an exhale. We've all just been sitting, so it shouldn't be that hard to plug back into it. What happens at the very end of the exhale? In that small gap between the breaths, you don't have to try and create a pause if there isn't one there. There's at least a turning point. There's at least a moment between the breaths where nothing's happening. And you sense that sense of stillness that's there. It can be called the still point. And if we notice it, can we let ourselves kind of sink into it, invite it to come along with us through the rest of the breath cycle? Let's just try that for a few breaths, see what we notice. Is there a particular sense of stillness we can allow ourselves to receive and engage with at the end of the exhale? Sometimes to notice that is briefly unsettling because there's just a moment where nothing's happening. Some part of the mind may feel uneasy about that because nothing's happening. Do I exist at all? But if we look right beneath that kind of disorientation that some of you may experience, not everyone experiences it. If you look right beneath that sense of disorientation, notice how nice it is. There's nothing happening. Isn't this what I'm trying to find in meditation? Just a little break from all these things happening all the time. See if you can notice that, and if you appreciate it, some of it might start to stick, and just see if you go around the breath cycle, if some of it may start to stick. When you lose touch with it, you just look at the end of the next exhale. You might even notice that stillness and the pleasantness of it will almost draw us in if we let it do so. And then, does that change the quality of our noticing of the inhale? Or if it doesn't, that's fine too. We're just noticing. How does it feel? Carry the attention all the way through an inhale. There's ever-changing sensation, isn't there? It feels quite different from an exhale. And then the turning point at the top of the inhale, that has its own particular feeling. And then notice how body, mind, and emotions all naturally tend to settle during an exhale. Can we trace our attention to the length of the exhale? And maybe the next time we touch that turning point at the bottom of the exhale, that sense of immersion or stillness may be a little deeper, more accessible. Let's try that for a minute or two. So let's go on to some other points. But first, I'd be interested, could I have a show of hands of how many people noticed that still point, could see what I was pointing to? Isn't it interesting? It's palpable, isn't it? And a lot of you know that I've taught university students meditation for credit for 20 or so years at University of New Mexico in Taos. And when I realized that I could take that old discovery of mine and bring it forward and point it out to others, at first it didn't occur to me to do that. So at first, my university classes would take half a semester to settle down and be sitting well. And once I start pointing to the still point for people, because in general, people could see what I'm pointing to, at least after a few tries, or maybe the next class they come back and they see it. My classes at the university settled within maybe 3 weeks. Everyone's sitting well. It was kind of not only a discovery for me, but it's really helpful for other people, because I've come to realize that there's all sorts of stuff happening when we're sitting, and especially beginners don't necessarily know what's significant and what isn't. Somehow I intuitively knew when I found that oh, that must be kind of where we're headed in practice. Now, again, I know that we hear a lot in Zen that we're not supposed to have a goal, but that doesn't mean that we throw away all discernment. And like many things in practice, there's a bit of a paradox there. We don't want the kind of goal we're grasping after. If we grasp after it, it's not going to work. But that doesn't mean we can't notice when our practice is working or going deeper and when it isn't. Similar thing to this dictum we hear in practice a lot, that there's no bad sitting. And it's true and it's not true. It's a paradox, right? Yeah, everyone's going to have a day, including me, where the mind is just all stirred up and you can't seem to get settled. And that I'm pretty sure that happens to just about everyone at some point. But so it's true. If you have a day like that, you still sit the next day. There's no bad sitting. But if all your sittings are like that, then you're not really doing the practice, and you should notice that. And then you should be able to ask yourself creatively, using the creative mind, okay, what can I do that is going to help the situation and help me connect with the depth, the absorption, the stillness that I know is there. I've glimpsed it. And what can I do to get closer to that? And that is our own internal creative process that we're allowed to use. This, you could say this is about making the practice your own. And at first, yeah, we have to take instruction, we follow the rules, and Zen can look pretty rule bound. However, when we're sitting on our cushion, we have absolute freedom to do whatever works for us. So yeah, we take the teacher's suggestions, and the teacher's like a coach. The teacher's giving you a system of practices that are time honored and have worked over time for many people. But inevitably, you get to a point where you have to engage it yourself, because the models or the templates that come down through the ages are things that work for most people, at least at some point, particularly in beginning practice. But then the people who really transform their lives or end up completing their practice, and as it were, it's never complete, but sitting in the teacher's seat, and that's always only a few people. I wonder at that why there shouldn't be more. But I've talked to a lot of teachers. From a lot of you know my book One Bird One Stone, where I traveled around the country talking to many something like 100 senior students and teachers. And my sense is that those who really were transformed through the practice were those who took the liberty to take their teacher's guidance and weigh it against their own experience. And then what starts to happen is you become more mature in your practice. Checking in with the teacher is a lot of sharing what you found that's working for you. And then the teacher can tell you if you're off base, if you're headed in a direction that is going to take you into a metaphorical ditch, right? And so teacher is like a coach in that way. If you were a coach in long distance running, for instance, the teacher will say, if you keep running that way, you're going to hurt yourself, you're going to damage yourself. So you need to, really try this. But still the runner's got to do the work, right? So you all have to do your own work. You can't wait to be told what to do. There are many examples where my teachers told me something that I weighed against my own experience and found it didn't work for me. One thing was my early teachers, that being Maizumi Roshi and Daido Roshi from Zen Mountain Monastery, who incidentally Rinzin also practiced with. He had turned out Rinzin and I probably did 10 years of sessions together without, I didn't really know him, but he practiced there too. And what I found early on with both Maizumi and Daido, as wonderful as Daido was as a teacher, he was a very grand and great teacher, very gifted teacher. When I had all sorts of emotion come up in my early practice, which I now see as, I didn't quite realize it at the time, but I was getting rid of a big backlog. Getting rid of is the wrong word. I was working through a backlog of emotion from my childhood. I was in the foster home for 2 years. That's a big deal for a 6-year-old kid. So probably certainly my first 5, maybe as many as 10 years of sessions, retreats, I would have this experience of these giant balls of emotion coming up. I would feel like I was burning up on the cushion. I couldn't even tell you if it was anger, grief, fear. It was just like this raw emotion that would completely take me over. And I even coined my own phrase for it. I called it walking through the fire, because it would happen every retreat, somewhere in the middle. And it's very overwhelming. And at first I couldn't figure out what to do with it. So I go to Maizumi Roshi, who was Japanese, or Daido, who had absorbed the Japanese training from Maizumi Roshi. And I'd say, what do I do with this emotion? And Japanese culture isn't big on emotion, and Zen picked that up and very much has the samurai approach of, we're tough, we don't do anything as wimpy as emotion, And so what I found is they just said, just go back to the breath. And, I'd been through therapy and I just knew that was wrong. I knew there was something significant happening with this emotion. And sure enough, just about every teacher now allows for emotion, brings in emotion, understands that when we clear the space of the mind, that emotion's going to come up, that we all have a backlog of stored emotion, and that's going to arise, and it's going to demand our attention, and we're better off giving it our attention. And however long that was, I think it was actually closer to 10 years, it just stopped happening at a certain point. And I felt like this giant load had got off my shoulders. And I finally went into some of the old teachings and I found this phenomena referred to as burning off karma. And I thought, well, that's what that was, burning off at least the personal karma of cause and effect that had stamped me so deeply from my childhood experience. And at this point, I feel like that childhood experience is so far behind me. It feels like it it's a story as though it happened to somebody else, and I have not had an issue with, no significant issue with depression or anxiety for decades now. So by following my own inner knowing, which is always of primary importance, and just realizing, oh, I can't talk to my teachers about this, so I just have to handle it myself, threw me back on my own resources. This giant load came off. What did I discover? I discovered that I'm actually an extrovert, and I'm not fundamentally bound by anxiety or depression. Of course, everybody will have transient anxiety float by for a moment or two. It's just part of the normal human condition. Or you may have a low emotional moment or day. That's part of the human condition, but it doesn't grow into these spirals of anxious thinking and feeling, or depressive anxious and feeling and thinking that I would have in my youth that would last for weeks sometimes, or months. I think there was one point in my early 30s where I was depressed chronically for several years. But eventually that all passed because I learned how to interrupt the ruminative thought processes that were taking a transient experience and pinning it into place. You feel a little low one day, the mind wants to explain why you feel low. Well, I have to go to this lousy job and I don't want to get up this early in the morning. And you start thinking like that, and then you feel worse the next day, right? And the next day it's like, oh, but we're all stuck in this rat race. And what's wrong with our society? And everything's so screwed up. And how did it turn into a 40-hour week and we don't even own our own lives? And then the next day you wake up feeling even worse. It takes about less than a week before you're near suicidal, right? It's if you let that thought spiral continue. But this basic practice of letting go of thoughts and returning to direct experience, if you start using that in everyday life, and you take on a certain pattern like that, over time, you can make great strides in overcoming these kind of, and there are other kinds of cycles. There's cycles of irritability, or who knows what else. But these patterns of mind that formed before we were fully cognizant of them, and they'll just keep running themselves if we don't intervene in them. And getting that bigger implication that I'm not just sitting on the cushion and as though by magic my whole life's going to turn over, when I started really engaging with it. And for me it meant letting go of anxious thoughts during my day and returning to direct experience. And when it came to depressive thoughts, I finally took that on in my mid-30s, and it was quite a struggle to work with. If you're going to take this on, I suggest working with one pattern. You can't work with every kind of negative thought pattern or every thought pattern that causes you pain at once. But if you take on one and give it a concerted effort, I remember that the negative self-talk, which was negative thinking overall, but specifically negative self-talk, was causing my depression. When I really took that on, it took me something like 18 months to really get free of it. Now, in the course of a lifetime, I've lived almost 70 years at this point. I'm in my 70th year. I'll be 70 this year. It's 18 months. It's nothing. It's, I took that on my mid-30s, and, it's for more than 30 years, it's not been a problem. It was worth the effort. But I had to let go of those kind of thoughts 1,000 times. And then that's just the first week, right? So, and you have to do it when you're off the cushion. But that kind of engagement with the implication, we sit and we let go of thoughts all the time. We return to direct experience. So that's and there is a system, which I'll share with you at some other time, that comes from the 5 skandhas or aggregates that can be really helpful in working with seeing how this pattern goes, where we start with a direct experience, and we get an overlay of thoughts going, and it restimulates the experience and starts a whole cycle that it's very hard to get out of. At some point, I'll do another talk where I talk about that more specifically. And knowing that at a certain point was helpful. But the main thing is just realizing there were patterns of thoughts that were causing me pain. I didn't choose to put them in my head. They just grew there before I knew what was happening. And what if I took them on and let go of those patterns of thought specifically? I recommend it. It was, like I say, it was quite a struggle, but in the end it worked. I'm no longer prone to anxiety or depression. I'm just not, and I can tell you life's a lot better now without those two burdens. Now, something I often tell beginner meditators is there can be a remarkable thing at some point early in our practice, which is certain patterns that caused us pain may drop away all by themselves. And isn't that marvelous? Isn't that wonderful? We start sitting, and certain things that used to bother us don't bother us anymore. And certainly just sitting, the practice has its own integrity. It has some effect all by itself without us having to do anything. But sometimes the way I lay it out is this, that if you really take on sitting, even just for, a year, you may find that roughly a third of your problems just drop off all by themselves. How remarkable, But the next third of your problems are the ones I'm talking about that you have to tussle with, like anxiety or depression, right? And they'll take a bit of a tussle. And then the last third, they may just be core issues that we have to deal with all our lives. They may not go away. But that doesn't mean we can't gain tools to deal with them so they don't dominate our lives, right? So I think it's kind of common for people to experience that first dropping away of certain things. And then when that stops happening, they disappear from the Sangha. I've seen this happen so many times. People will be really enthusiastic for a year or 2 years or 3 years. And then it's a lot like being in love, right? You're in the honeymoon phase. And then things kind of flatten out, and it's not always a thrill, and there's not always the same revelations and wonder happening day by day. And so we think, well, it stopped working, or it can seem so natural to have some of our suffering go away. It is very natural that we feel like, this is what being human should feel like. And I guess I'm just this way now. But the truth is, in general, we're not just this way now. If we stop practicing, a lot of those issues will creep back in, So creative engagement with the practice. Hey, I'm letting go of thoughts. That must mean I'm not my thoughts. That must mean maybe I can do something about these thoughts that are tormenting me. That's the way it was for me. Anxious thoughts and depressive thoughts were tormenting me. And I finally realized, well, I don't think Maizumi Roshi or Daido is going to come in and pluck them out of my head. I'm going to have to do it myself. They've taught me methods. What if I use this method? Even going into the emotions that I couldn't talk about with them, that was still the method I'd learned. I was just expanding it and saying, okay, these balls of emotion are coming up. I just got to sit with them. Forget the breath. This is what's calling for my attention, and sure enough, I'd experience that for maybe a day in session, and all of a sudden I'd realize that ball of emotion had cleared. And I'd sign up for the next session because afterwards I felt so good. And then I'd be in the middle of the next one and I'd go, oh my God, what did I do to myself? Because here it is again. But after a while, it took some years, but after a while, it completely stopped happening. Never happens anymore. So, and the funny thing was, I knew I was burning off karma or processing those emotions, but there was never any content to them. It was pure emotion. And it felt like I was dealing with them in a concentrated manner. It wasn't like therapy is wonderful and I recommend it for everyone, psychotherapy. I really do. It helped me understand the roots of my suffering, but it didn't tell me how to release it all. Some of it released, but when this started happening in retreat, it did not pass through my conscious mind. It felt like in a concentrated way, it was clearing itself in a way. If you've done therapy, you kind of know that you'll never catch up, right? You learn the roots of certain sufferings and pains, and it's very, very useful to learn that. And some of it you'll be able to let go, but there's always new problems surfacing and new restimulation surfacing, and you can go on forever and never get to the end of it. Of course, practice is like that too. I don't know if we can ever clear everything out of our emotional body in this lifetime, but it's certainly very effective, and I felt tons lighter when it finally passed. I felt like if I tried to process this stuff consciously, I'd still be doing it now, but it just came up in zazen that big chunks of it in a concentrated way could process themselves. So another thing I noticed, several things I've noticed about working with the mind is um, one of the things that happened at a certain point, and I was some years into my practice. I was probably more than 10 years into my practice, and we're all somewhat experienced here, and we've probably had the experience of having heard something again and again in Dharma talks or read something again and again, and it sounds true enough, but then one day we hear it, or we hear it in a different way, and you get it in a deeper way, right? Or you get it from you hear it from another angle, and it penetrates in a different way, a deeper way. Maybe you had it intellectually before, but you get it in your gut in a different way, and that can come from anywhere. I was reading a New York Times book review of all things one night before I was going to bed. This was some years ago. And I ran across this phrase just in the middle of a book review that said, well, of course, language completely conditions the way we see the world. And it just struck me, and I thought, is that so? And, if any of you studied literature, you may have run across, probably most of you don't know of this, but for a while, there was a postmodern school of literary criticism that was influenced by Buddhism that basically maintained, well, it went a bit too far. It would say that no piece of literature or writing has an inherent meaning. It's all in the meaning we bring to it. And there's some insight in that, but it's too extreme. As an author myself, I know there's some inherent meaning that I put in there, but I also know that people are going to interpret it. To say that it's all something we project upon it, that's dualistic thinking. It's either or thinking. It's not dualistic. There's meaning there, and we bring our own meaning to it. But that statement that just language completely conditions our world, I thought, how interesting. I thought, is that really true? And I didn't even think of the Dharma at first with it, It's just like reflecting on it. And I went to sleep, and I woke up in the middle of the night. All of a sudden, I was in kind of a samadhi state, like a real meditative state of absorption. I just woke up into that, and the thought arose in my mind, that's absolutely true. In the conventional way of seeing, that's pure Dharma. And it's also true from my experience that the conventional way of humans seeing reality is completely conditioned by language. maybe not completely, but is conditioned deeply, deeply by language, right? Meaning it's entirely possible to walk through a park and see trees, and all we're seeing is the word trees. We're not really seeing the trees individually. It's entirely possible for us to go to a conference and inhabit a room, and we're just in a room. And somebody afterwards asks what color was the walls, and we won't be able to say because all we saw was room. We didn't see characteristics, right? These things happen all the time. We learn language, and then if we're not careful, we go around, and what we're seeing is the words we have for things rather than the things itself. And we all do that to some extent. It's part of what we unlearn in Zazen. What's beyond that kind of mental knowing? Who are we when we're not thinking about who we are? If we're lucky enough to drop into the empty space, and we practice well enough to drop into the empty space between thoughts, at least occasionally, well, who are we? I'm walking around in conventional human terms thinking I'm a Sean. But how about when we're sitting there without thought and we're just sitting? We could be anyone. I don't know I'm Sean. I don't know how old I am. I don't know what language I speak, what country I live in. Could that be what the Buddhist's talking about when the Buddha talks about no self? Is the self really present? Well, all that's really present in a moment like that is presence. There's a feeling of being here and awareness, but I don't know a thing about who or what I don't know how old I am. I don't know my history, right? All that has to be downloaded. A lot of that came out from that kind of click, that insight in my mind about language conditioning reality. I mean, this is something I knew, but I didn't know it at that level, right? And so I was in this meditative state for a long time in the night, the thought came up, that's absolutely true, that's absolutely real. We hear that we should let go of thoughts. Well, sometimes the thought can lead you to something deeper. So I took in that thought. Sometimes insight comes in the terms of thought, but thought can have a place, but it should take the back seat. So, with me, that thought registered, and I thought, is that true? And I was in this natural meditative state, and I just went in and investigated, and then a series of further understandings happened as the next day I thought, that's remarkable. What's the implication of that? And when I pondered on it, I thought, well, that must mean that practice can't possibly be about thinking at all, that thoughts have no place in practice, or they have very little place in practice. So if I'm really practicing meditation, what's the space beyond thought? Space beyond thought's awareness. So I started putting that into practice. First I had to define for myself what a thought was. It seemed silly, but it was so helpful. I thought, okay, what are thoughts? Okay, thoughts are when words are coming through the mind. So those words that are coming through the mind can't possibly be what meditation's about, because meditation is about reality, not about our concepts about reality. And just defining that for myself was so helpful, because for a long time thereafter, I would sit down, and anytime a thought would arise in verbal form, I'd think, that's not what I'm doing here. And it was easy to let it go, So for months afterwards, every time I sat down, thoughts could not get a hold on me because that insight was operating, That insight came in the form of a thought. So the thought had a place, but then it takes the back seat, So when a thought came up, I could just, if I needed to, I could think, oh, that's a thought. It's just not what I'm doing here, right? So then I started to realize that most thoughts are about past and future. And so I got like a little bit of a tighter vision on it. This is the creativity I'm talking about. It's like, well, what are thoughts about? One thing is I had to expand it to visual thought because we could play little movies in our heads, right? And I had to realize, oh, that's also thinking. So that went too. But then I started to realize most verbal thoughts are about past or future. So I started putting that into practice. It's just like, that's a past thought. Dharma, Dharma practice can't be about the past. It's only about reality. It's only about what's happening now. That's a thought about the past. It just like it helped me make my mind kind of like Teflon. Past thought would slide off. Once I realized it was about the past, that can't possibly be what meditation is about, or about the future. That can't possibly be what meditation is about. Then I caught on that some of the other category of thoughts are present thoughts. Present thoughts are mostly judgmental. It's like, am I doing the practice right? Am I not doing the practice right? Am I doing it better than Stuart? Oh, look at Anthony. There he is in his robes. He looks like he's practicing perfectly. I'll never practice that well. Or the opposite. Anthony sitting there in his robes. He thinks he's such a good practitioner. I'm better than he is, right? It's present moment thinking tends to be whether we're up or down, right? You know. And then I realized, well, that's got to be pointless. So that couldn't get hold in my mind for a while. But what happens is these methods, creative methods of how to work with the mind, they tend to wear out after a while because they lose that excitement of freshness. And then they start to sneak back in. And then, so there's a whole sequence of me learning these things bit by bit, and each new one would again give me better access to that state. Finally, I realized that, wait a minute, if it's all about awareness, then any object that appears in the mind can't possibly be it, right? If we're looking for wholeness, if we're looking for the whole thing, any part of the thing can't possibly be it. So anything that's an object of mind, anything the mind wanted to fasten on, any sensory input or anything can't possibly be it. And so that gave me access to very open state of meditation for a long time, because anything that would come up in perception, it's just like, that's not it. So it slid off like Teflon, right? So this process of creativity led me a long way, you know. And then one day I remember we used to caretake a nature preserve for 17 years. I was the caretaker of a nature preserve with hot springs, and very fortunate deal because our rent was very low, and gave me a lot of time for practice and writing and such. And but the property had a gate. I remember one day I was opening the gate, and just all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, what are the objects of mind made of? You know, can they be truly separate from awareness? I just thought, they appear in awareness. Could they exist without awareness? I don't think they could exist without awareness, at least not in my perceptions. So the objects of mind must be made of mind. They must be inseparable from mind. And so then that opened up something for a long time. So I know this is a bit of a long and convoluted story, and I want to move over to us talking, but I just want to illustrate for you how this first creative engagement, what did it lead to? 5 or 6 subsequent ways of engaging with what the mind is and what the mind is doing, which well, they changed everything about how I deal with my mind, right? Then, I got to the point where I could no longer take anything that appeared in the mind that seriously, and pretty much everything stopped bothering me. And to this day, almost nothing bothers me. How can it bother you? It's all coming out of the mind. It's all part of the same thing. It's not that Buddhism doesn't hold, nor do I, with the entire thing being an illusion. That's if anything, the Vedic tradition out of which Buddhism grew, still some schools of Vedic philosophy still hold that the whole thing's just a dream. We don't really see it that way. We just, we see everything as mind, but, or inseparable from mind, but that doesn't mean there's nothing there. And that doesn't mean there's nothing to take care of. Doesn't mean it's all unreal. Suffering is certainly real enough, isn't it? If you go into a traditional Zen master, and and you go in and, the old style where they have a stick, like in the old stories, and you go in and you say, I just realized nothing is real. There's nothing whatsoever to trouble us. That's when the Zen master hits you with the stick and says, oh, why does that hurt? You know? So you have to acknowledge that certain things are significant and real and we have to deal with them. But nonetheless, we start to release our mental projections and we start to experience, once we're not fastened on the objects of awareness, everything's not so broken up into pieces. We start to see the whole thing. We start to realize that maybe everything's not as big a problem as I thought it was. Maybe I can live with life in a more harmonious way without fighting those individual things that appear in my awareness and seem so problematic, right? Maybe I can just see, oh, of course this stuff comes up. It's human condition. Maybe I can hold it more lightly though. Maybe it's not such a big deal when my car has a flat tire. Maybe it's not such a big deal when the hot water heater breaks and we have to call in a plumber. Maybe the daily things of life are not such big issues. Maybe the practice can really bring me some kind of peace. Wouldn't that be nice? If I could have more peace. But like I say, we'll get some peace and clarity just by doing the practice, and we can expect some issues and problems to just drop away. But I'm talking about inside us, what can we discover? I didn't check these methods out with my teachers. I was seeing my teachers all the time, and sometimes I tell them about it, but sometimes I just knew if something I discovered took me to a deeper state of samadhi, obviously working, so we can find out for ourselves what takes us to a deeper state of samadhi, and we can be free to one of the things that eventually grew was a lot of the times to this day I don't have to use any method to sit. I can just sit down and just meditate. It doesn't require a method. Now that doesn't always work, and when it doesn't work, I'll go back to counting the breath or something like that, But basically, I could sit down for a few minutes. My thoughts are doing their things. They want to finish their work, right? And then an open space opens up. It's only momentary, and if I put my attention there, anyway, that's my method at this point. But that all grew. It's kind of a natural, what we call just sitting or shikantaza. You just go into the open space of awareness, and sure, there's stuff floats by in there, but none of it sticks, And then if it starts sticking, I'll go back to counting the breath just to keep myself honest, make sure I'm really doing the practice. I'll use anything that works, and that's a whole creative bag of tricks, including the beginning methods, So I'd love to hear from other people. And is there anything you discovered for yourself that it's been helpful that maybe your teachers didn't tell you, but you found it for yourself? And I found people come up with the most amazing stuff that I never thought of sometimes, that help them connect. We all know what that space feels like when it's working, right? And so we can find what helps us get there. Okay, I see a gasho on the right. Yes. Who's that? I can't see you all.
This is Gokyo or Tony.
Gokyo, hey, Gokyo.
It's
Yeah.
good to see you. I just want to share what just happened as you were talking for me, and you were talking about going into the still point at the bottom of the breath. And all of a sudden, as I was doing that, this memory came rushing back, and I remembered 6th grade camp, which was, I think, for me, the first time I ever paid attention to my breath. We were there, and there were some like EMS people there, and they were trying to teach us about our heart rate and respirations and stuff like this. And we were asked to count how many times we breathe. We cycled through the breath over a minute or something like this. And I remember as a kid of 6th grader discovering that sort of space at the bottom and hanging out there. And when we all had to give a number of times we did this, mine was like insanely low. And they were made a joke about, are you alive? Are you okay? And I remember feeling a lot of shame about that with my peers because everyone else had these normal numbers. And I think I've been avoiding that space. So you labeling that memory just came right up for me, and
Oh, interesting.
playing with that, I'm excited to like spend more time there.
Great,
So thank you so much for that. I just wanted to
great.
share that. It's great.
Gokyo, I could have told you as soon as I met you that you're not normal.
Thank you.
Not,
Sensei, when I shared 10 years ago, when I shared with my family that I was no longer going to be Catholic, I was going to be Buddhist. My oldest sister said, "You've always been weird." So
there you
yeah,
go.
I'll take
Yeah.
it. But thank you so
Good.
much for pointing that
Join the
out and
weird,
sharing that.
join the weird family. It's not only that. All of you who left the other sangha, you're all the unusual ones, which one day they may regret. That they lost all the good ones. You know, I'm I'm slightly kidding, but I'm not kidding. Also, that um, it's really common that sometime earlier in life we had glimpses before we ever heard even of Buddhism, and it's like we were already called to it. And I'm so sorry that you got shamed for it because, um, well, what if the memory comes up? There's probably some feeling that comes up with it. And if you go and work with that, I bet you're going to get some emotion that comes up. If you sit with that emotion, it will it won't suspend itself. That's why the memory came up. And if it spends itself, you'll just be free to glory in that space of stillness. And I think you'll I think you'll discover something really wonderful there. You know, of course, the conventional world wants to stop you from going there. Of course, it does. Okay. You're supposed to go out and make money and make something of yourself. And and start a family and buy a house and all of us who are some way immersed in the practice, we know that there's more. All those things are great, are fine, but we're not 100% satisfied with just that, are we? With something else. Yeah, let me know how it goes next time we talk, okay? Yeah, yeah, enjoy it. So, yeah, anyone else want to share? Yes, I think that might be
I kind of get the blur.
Kelly in the back. Yeah.
Yes. So the one thing I have found is that through sitting and becoming awareness with the present, is that 99% of what happens to me or is done requires zero input whatsoever from me. I don't have to react to it. And by choosing not to react to it, I keep that peace.
Mhm.
And it's interesting. Even the things that I do, require me to have some type of input in, are not as bad as I thought they were. They're actually pretty minimal.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge transformation for me because I was on top of everything. Everything had to be done right. Everything had to be perfect. And letting go of that has been a lifesaver, really.
Wonderful. Glory in it. Yeah, really. Just enjoy it and glory in it. The practice is supposed to reduce our suffering. And there is an issue of spiritual bypassing. And some people take that the wrong way. They think, I don't want to spiritually bypass. Therefore, when I get a flat tire, if I feel upset, I should go with that upset. Well, not exactly. Spiritual bypassing means I don't care what's happening with the world. That's spiritual bypassing. Um, or somebody died, or, I've just been diagnosed with cancer, if we find ourselves that blank, that's spiritual bypassing, right? Those are important things. We should feel something when we see the suffering of others. We should feel something when the world seems overwhelming. We should feel something when someone close to us dies. Um, but we should feel something uh, if we engage in some misbehavior. The teachers we've seen who misstep and have affairs with their students or misuse finances or alcohol or things like that. they're spiritually bypassing. They're using the aperture of practice to say those things don't matter. Yeah. And so we have to watch ourselves, and we don't want to cultivate pure blankness. But if the everyday things of life, and even if past things that used to trigger us a lot stop triggering us, that's just what's supposed to happen, right? It's that's what practice is for, you know. Eventually what happens, and maybe some of you who've talked to me deeply about things in Doksan or in private meetings, maybe you've seen this, but eventually you come to this point where you can openly hear another person's struggles and pain and be compassionate about it, but it doesn't upset you in a way that you carry it away afterwards and lie awake worrying about it afterwards. You're able to hold this in a compassionate way, but without being weighted down by it. That's part of a process that happens during practice. In fact, those of us who work in helping professions, you probably know what I'm talking about, that somebody's story can strike you and you take it home and you're lying awake at night. And, you hope to get to this point where you're open enough that their suffering doesn't strike your unresolved areas and activate them, which is really what's happening when we react in that way. It's useful because we can notice that, we can sit with that, but eventually you get to the point where it kind of passes through you in a way. You're open to it because you're not concerned that it's going to strike something in you that's going to cause you suffering. So, and if we've built up walls that prevent that from happening, which usually we have, those walls start coming down. And sometimes for a little while, we think, oh no, we're getting more sensitive. These things are striking me more, but that will pass, that will pass. And we eventually get to this point where I can't tell you the things I've heard from students, that terrible instances of suffering, but, I've been able to hear them without fearing and, having filters up to prevent it from hitting me. I've been able to let it in without it activating me for the most part. It's an ongoing practice, but yeah. But that's great. That's great, Kelly. I'm so glad because you deserve that. You deserve that freedom from suffering. Yeah.
It's interesting too because I started therapy for PTSD and several other issues, and I had this massive breakthrough, and even my therapists were, I kept thanking them, and they're like, "It's not us. It's your practice. It's you sitting on that cushion is what's doing this." Yeah. And it took me a while to really understand that because I thought, I kind of attributed everything to, the tools they were giving me. But, it was a combination of using those tools and being serious about my practice. Yeah. It really relieved all that. And I still have issues, but, they're pretty deep. But I'm working through them and I can see it's more through my practice than it is the work that my therapists are having me do.
That's great. Well, both things are useful. For me, knowing the roots, for instance, I'd done therapy before Zazen. So when those emotions came up in Zazen, because I'd done therapy, I knew don't just let go of them and go back to the breath. That's samurai culture leaking over to the West, and we've got a different understanding of psychology, and I'm going to use it, but knowing, but also knowing the roots of things has let me know very clearly they're in the past and makes it easier to let go of them, right? Because I know where they came from, I understand them, and I understand that now is now. So the combination together is pretty unbeatable. I'm sure both things have had a big effect, but psychotherapy is a wonderful practice, but we also know people who've been through years of psychotherapy and they're 60 years old and they're still mad at their mother, and because they don't have the letting go side of it, and practice gives us the letting go side of it. Some people figure out how to let go, but some people never do. And when they hit practice, it's like, oh boy, okay, I can let go of the thoughts around this. That means the feelings come up. That means I process the feelings. That means it starts to drain away as a problem. So we can really get beyond this stuff. Yeah. Anyone else got anything to share or ask? Yes.
Um,
Is that Monica Ando? Yeah.
so kind of like what you were talking about just a second ago, like this form of practice really lines up with EMDR, which is something that I'm currently doing, and it allows me to not just work with my therapist on processing these things and letting them go, but it's strengthening my practice because as soon as I get done with therapy, I will meditate to keep myself calm, so that I don't allow anything that was difficult from the session to really have any control over how I feel or what I'm gonna do next, and the combination, they go kind of hand in hand.
Yeah, that's a wise approach, Ando, and that's also what I'm talking about creativity. I don't, did anybody ever tell you it's good to sit after therapy? Maybe they did, but very likely not. You probably just realized it and creatively engaged it, you know? So that's what I'm talking about. How do you, so I've learned this tool. What do I do with this tool? Well, actually, Ando, I think you have a lot of, I've seen a lot of evidence of that in how you use your practice. You're thinking creatively about it. You're intuiting creatively about it and putting it creatively into practice. And I encourage you to just, Daido Roshi used to say, especially early in uh, in his years of teaching, he used to always say, the most important thing is to deeply trust yourself. And isn't it funny? Because Buddhism's always going on about no self. But so what's he talking about? He's talking about the true self, right? And, we get into the problem of language, and it's not meant to be a dichotomy. Is there a self? Isn't there a self? We'll never pin that one down, will we? But if you deeply trust your true self, your deep self, then a lot of the surface problems of the shallow self just become like a chop on the surface of the sea. The depths are still, doesn't need to stir you up all the way to the bottom. So, whereas before it probably used to, so there's something in ourselves that's intuitive that draws us deeper, and that's our true nature, and we need to follow that and trust it. And if you have doubts about it, that's what a teacher's for. You check it out with the teacher. Intuition, I found in my life, intuitive knowing has been right 90% of the time. The other 10%, you can be fooled. I always say intuition's always right unless it's about love or money. You find yourself thinking, I'm going to make $1 million from that. That's not necessarily intuition. You find yourself thinking, because I'm really attracted to this person, they must be attracted to me. Not necessarily intuition. We're too attached, right? But in the norm of life, for instance, I always knew a sangha would show up. Isn't it funny? From the time I received the Dharma transmission, which was 7 years ago, I just had this intuitive knowing, let's just wait and the right people are going to show up. And, the thinking mind doubts stuff like that. But it's proven to be true. All of you have shown up and you keep coming back. And so I'm glad I trusted that and didn't rush to try and, make something happen. I could never have created this situation. And the other thing, I always wanted to work with people who were more experienced. And a lot of you are. So how funny that I somehow knew that that was the right thing. And I couldn't have made that up. Couldn't have made it happen. So, yeah, but it's not about love or money, so I trust it. Teaching's never about money, is it? Come on. I guess we're out of time, but I'd encourage you all to take this approach in your own practice. Find out what works, trust it, follow it. Anything, whatever deepens your practice, keep trying it. But don't be surprised, because oftentimes the first thing you find, it'll work. I just described the whole progression of things that worked really well, each one for maybe some months or 6 months or maybe a year. Then it started to wear out, but then there was another dimension to it that kind of reactivated, and it kept going deeper, and any method will wear out because the human mind likes the diversity. So it likes the new. So you may have to always find new things. And besides, you can never go back, at least not very much. So just keep the investigation going, and you'll keep finding new dimensions and new barriers, and then you'll find a new dimension to overcome that barrier. Yeah. So, and let's talk about it when I talk to you all individually.
Thank you, Sensei.
Thank you.
We'll now close with the Bodhisattva vows. If you're using the chanting packet, they're on the last page. Inexhaustible delusions Thank you, Sensei. Thank you, everyone online. Thank you, everyone here.
Thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.